Hello and welcome. Piracy off the coast of Somalia has been grabbing the headlines recently, but it's only a reflection of the deepening crisis the country faces. For 17 years, Somalia has not had a functioning government, with the current ineffective transitional federal government controlling very little outside the capital, Mogadishu. On Christmas Eve 2 years ago, Ethiopian forces entered at the invitation of the government to fight Islamic militants who threatened to take over the country. It was a bid to bring stability for the first time in Somalia's modern history. Well, now the Somali people find themselves in the crossfire between Ethiopian and government forces, insurgents, warlords and criminals. The United Nations estimates that more than 3 million Somalis, almost half the population, are in need of urgent food aid. But the situation's unsafe for foreign aid workers and the country's been left to fester in its violence. So today we ask, is Somalia becoming the next Afghanistan? Remember, you can join with our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter that chat room there and you can take part. We also welcome your phone calls on the show. To discuss the issues today, we have Professor Ahmed Samatar, who teaches at the Macalester College in Minnesota, from where he joins us. Professor Samatar is author of Somalia, State Collapse, Multilateral Intervention and Strategies for Political Reconstruction. And in London we have Roger Middleton, the specialist on Northeast African affairs at the British think tank CHATHAM House and author of a detailed report on the threat of the Somali pirates. I welcome you both to the show. And Dr. Samatar,
thank you very much.
Good, sir. Good to have you with us. Now, Dr. Samatar, if I can start with you. The news really is, I guess, that Ethiopia is about to pull its troops out of Somalia with about 10 days to go, it seems, if they keep to their deadline of the end of December. What impact do you expect to have that to have on Somalia? Is it going to be chaos, as the UN Secretary General predicts?
Well, could be, but in the first place, I think the Ethiopian invasion should never have taken place. The cost of that has been tremendous. 10,000 dead, over 25,000 wounded, over 1 million now homeless as a result of the destruction of Mogadishu. The Ethiopian invasion was a mad policy and it should never have taken place. Secondly, there is a resistance movement in the country. It's not just chaotic. A resistance movement in the country that has been there for a significant period of time. And that significant resistance movement has different dimensions. Some are more militant than others. But that movement has been working and fighting not only to get the Ethiopians out of the country, but then to get hold of the reins of power in the society so that Somalia will finally return to some form of order and governance. And the transitional federal government was, in its original conception, quite illegitimate. It became incompetent. And as you can now watch, it is almost like the last 5 minutes of a football game as far as the transitional federal government is concerned. It's really, for all practical purposes, a historical artifact.
Now, Dr. Samatar, if that's the case, I mean, I know your perspective, obviously your personal perspective on the Ethiopian troop situation, but let me ask you, when there's been talk about the Ethiopian troops withdrawing, there's been talk about them being replaced by countries that are friends of Somalia, excluding neighboring states. What moves have been made on that front, and would an alternative force be suitable in your case, considering Somalia seems to be so dysfunctional?
Well, in my analysis, I have always argued that given the fact that the Somalis, at least thus far, have not been able to rise up to the challenge of reclaiming their own national institutions in a very successful fashion, the coming of international forces that are neutral in the process will be a welcome phenomena. We now know, I think it was announced today or yesterday through Addis Ababa, the African Union, that the Nigerian government has now made a commitment to send some forces to Somalia, which will beef up maybe some of the other African forces there. So there is certainly the danger of a vacuum. But I think it is important not to dismiss the national resistance movement. Some of it is Islamicist in a very militant sense. Some of it is not. But they have the potential, as they have done, you will remember, just prior to the invasion of Ethiopia, to pick up the pieces and begin to build a new national consensus.
Okay. Let me bring in Roger Middleton. Good to have you with us as well, sir. They're joining us from London. And let me ask you, you've written in detail about the Somali pirates, an issue that finally got the world's attention. But the rest of the crisis, the humanitarian crisis, the disaster that's been taking place, human trafficking, the civilians caught in the crossfire, all that seems to have been off the international radar. Considering all that's going on, I wonder why.
Well, it's an excellent question. I mean, the piracy is clearly a big problem internationally. It's a big problem for Somalia as well, and that the money that it generates helps feed this terrible war that is causing all this suffering that Dr. Samatar was talking about. But you're very right. The international community, I think, has found Somalia a very difficult country to understand with problems that are very complicated, with many sides, many different factions. And I think, in one sense, it may be a slight oversimplification, but this is too difficult to solve. Let's leave it. Let's let them fight it out amongst themselves. And that's really one of the reasons why we're seeing this terrible, terrible situation now.
Let's get a call. We've got a caller on the line straight away. ABDUL is in the UK. ABDUL, what would you like to ask, please?
What I want to ask is, why is there lack of, at the moment what I see is there's lack of confident accountability, if you like, in Somalia. What you've got is you've got people, the European Union sort of backing and, you know, like putting a lot of resources in. You've got the Americans putting a lot of resources in. And what isn't clear from the look of things is like everyone is just doing what they want to do, and there's no accountability at all whatsoever. And obviously supporting such a lame so-called interim government.
Actually, ABDUL, let me put this to Roger Middleton and ask, you know, to what extent is that transitional federal government largely to blame because of the fact that it's got its own internal divisions and problems, and pretty much everything's been left to sort of Wild West frontier kind of situation?
Yeah. Well, the transitional federal government, it's a government in name only. It controls not even the whole of Mogadishu, maybe a couple of city blocks of Mogadishu, and even those only very tentatively, and really only because of the support of the Ethiopian and Ugandan troops that are there at the moment. It's not a very effective government. I mean, there was a Human Rights Watch report that came out very recently that it had very damning things to say about police force, the army, the security services, also about all of the opposition factions, Al-Shabaab, ARS troops, and also against the Ethiopians and African Union troops who are in Somalia. So there is blame on all sides, but the transitional federal government has completely failed to establish control over anything like a significant amount of Somalia. It spent a lot of time with this internal bickering. Only recently the president sacked the prime minister. The prime minister was then reinstated by the parliament. The president is now being impeached by the parliament, and you can see there's some very these are the death throes of the transitional federal government. But even at its height, it was never been an effective force.
Let me put an a live station question to Dr. Samatar here. It came in from Tony, who's on the live station chat room right now. Dr. Samatar, you mentioned about the role that perhaps a neutral force could play in Somalia, but this question from Tony says, what role could other African nations have in attempting to reconstruct Somalia?
Well, Roger has in fact spoken quite sharply and I think on target in terms of the weakness of the transitional federal government and the original illegitimacy of its creation and the absence of any kind of competence at the level of leadership. Not that necessarily the opposition are better in terms of legitimacy and competence either, but at least there might be some promise there. I think the tragedy is that the African states, the African Union, is a very feeble organization with minimum capacity in terms of resources and minimum capacity in terms of military capacity to kind of pull into Somalia and stand between the warring factions and then create a context in which security will become available for people to dialogue. So I'm not quite sure whether the African Union would have at least the military wherewithal to undertake this. They will probably need, they might have the manpower, but they will need enormous investment on the part of the international community. And I must add this point. The international community really has not invested much in Somalia in the last 17 years. There have been few millions of dollars here and there, which has essentially become money for people who are meeting in hotels to kind of a bargain over state power that does not exist. Deep investment in the welfare of the Somali people to pick up the pieces and find new leaders who can understand the international system, who understand the regional context, and who understand that are committed to the welfare of our people. That has not yet taken place, and that's one of the major problems.
Okay. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by. We have to take a very short break here now. More of our discussion in a moment. As we pause, we remind you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see the debates taking place there right now, and we'll be right back.
Dum